So our Advent series this year features quilts at the center. For instance, each week there is a new square pattern, like this one here on the screen, that symbolizes that week's theme. And so last Sunday, during our Advent craft workshop after worship, many of us were coloring these different squares and their different patterns. The hope is to put those together and to make a large paper quilt to symbolize all of the ways that these promises, these reminders that we're going to explore throughout this series, the way that they wrap us, these reminders that we need to hear over and over again as we navigate life's many endings and beginnings. And as the sermon title indicates, this week's Advent reminder for such seasons is that you cannot go it alone. And I love the quilt square symbolizing this theme. Some of you might know this, but it's known as the log cabin design. And it might go back to the Underground Railroad. Some scholars believe that quilts with their various patterns were used during this secretive revolution to aid enslaved people as they embarked on those treacherous journeys north to freedom. Hung out on clotheslines or fences in full view, these quilts used different patterns to send messages whose meanings were hidden except to the initiated. Quilts with these certain patterns indicated that this was a safe house along the Underground Railroad. It was strangers helping strangers get free through small gestures of compassion that could also cost them their lives if they were found out. And when a quilt with the log cabin design was displayed, these scholars say it meant that one should seek shelter now and that the people in this home were safe. That they would hide and care for you until you set out for the next stop on your journey to freedom, to your new beginning. And I've been thinking a lot about this lately, especially in the context of a church who has a history of involvement on the Underground Railroad. And while the facticity of that quilt history is debated among scholars, there's still an important truth here that cannot be understated and that I think vividly illustrates this morning's Advent reminder that you cannot go it alone. That no one ever has, no matter how courageous or strong or fierce they have been, and that no one can. That the American ideal of the self-made individual is not only fundamentally untrue, it's a toxic myth that has also woven itself into our social DNA, and that we must all consciously choose to resist time and time again in our lives. And that even while the journey of life is each of ours to make, no one else can make your journey for you. It is literally impossible for any of us to do alone. Now again, this is pretty obvious on the face of it, right? But that's often true of the most important truths in life. It's not that you need me to convince you of the truth per se, but that we need to be reminded that even though we know this to be true, we still tend to resist it. We literally will spend copious amounts of energy fighting against our own biology so as to not have to need others. We see this playing out in the Book of Ruth this morning as well. The Book of Ruth opens with the line, "In the day when the judges ruled," which is a reference to the dark and difficult days spoken of in the Book of Judges. It was a time when the people had been brought out of slavery in Egypt and into a land of promise. They were making this future together, but they had not yet formed a cohesive society. And so it was a time of chaos and disorder. In fact, the last verse of the Book of Judges, which is the verse immediately preceding this first verse of the Book of Ruth, reads, "In those days, the days of the judges, all the people did whatever was right in their own eyes." That is, people did whatever they wanted, whatever benefited themselves. That's what the text is trying to say, which is to say that they had forsaken that love of God, that primal commandment, which manifests as love for your neighbor, for taking care of each other. And so it's in that context of social breakdown that we hear the story of an Israelite family in Bethlehem, Elimelech, Naomi, and their sons Mahlon and Chilion, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, as each family is forced to look after themselves, they do what desperate people have always done and continue to do. They set out for another country in search of possibility. They migrate into the neighboring land of Moab, which also happened to be the Israelites' ancient enemy. Shortly after arriving, tragedy strikes. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, dies. The sons marry Moabite women named Ruth and Orpah. Before long, tragedy strikes again. And Naomi's 2 sons also die, leaving only Naomi and her daughters-in-law. Profoundly vulnerable situation in a patriarchal world where they would have few to no rights or protection. And amidst these heartbreaking endings, with no reason to stay, and in the hope that she'll soon find food back home, Naomi tells her daughters-in-law that she's migrating back to Bethlehem. Like her in Moab, she knows that their lives in Bethlehem as unmarried foreign widows would be especially difficult. And so she compels them to stay behind. Let me go on alone, Naomi pleads with them. Return to your families. Make a life. You have so much ahead of you. Find a way to start over here among your own people. But they plead just as stubbornly with Naomi in return. No, they insist. And through tears and rising voices, they continue, we don't want to leave you. We will not leave you. Stop pushing us away. And eventually Orpah relents and returns home to her family to begin again somehow. Right? And who can blame her? But still, Ruth shows this remarkable capacity for loyalty and friendship and steadfast love to Naomi. Refusing to the end, she famously tells her mother-in-law, stop pushing me away. Stop insisting that I stop following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And so the two of them return to Israel, and the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter, as she laments her tragic fate. The story continues on with a series of unexpected reversals. Through all of these bitter endings, God is somehow working a new beginning beyond anything Ruth or Naomi could have imagined, beyond anything they could have predicted, could have controlled their surroundings to make happen. Right? Certainly they had a role to play, they had choices and actions to make. But the story of Ruth and Naomi, like each of our stories, is a story of how God works in and through the unfolding of our lives, the mundane, everyday events, relationships, and choices that we make, such that no ending, no matter how bitter, is the end. Life is always emerging. Life is always beginning again, even when we can't yet see any evidence of it. But I know, just as you do, that is really hard to trust. Really easy to say, like most platitudes. But dang, is it hard to trust. But as in the story of Ruth and Naomi, at the center of those beginnings, from womb to tomb, is the gift of partnership, of friendship, of others who help make this life possible, who help nurture it within us when we don't have the strength to tend to the garden of our own souls. And that is what Ruth and Naomi are for each other. They are a reminder of how each of us is held together by friendship, by chosen family, by community. And that real relationship requires a degree of vulnerability that invites others to choose us, invites us to be chosen amidst our messiness. And for us, in the midst of life's busyness, the many things competing for our loyalty, our time, our attention, we too are invited to choose others. For Ruth and Naomi, there's another layer here. It's the fact that Ruth will be living amongst a people that will see her not only as a foreigner and will thus be suspicious of her from the beginning. She is one of those people. Namely, she comes from the enemy. She is a Moabite. She doesn't deserve to be here. She can't be trusted, the Israelites around her will say. I mean, they don't even trust each other at this point. But in a society that has failed to live out God's call to care for one another through hardship, it is this foreigner, this enemy, this woman, Ruth, who has not even worshiped their God, who nonetheless shows them the kind of love that their God calls them to, who nonetheless demonstrates the fierce courage and steadfast loyalty that we each long for and are called to extend. And when we, like Naomi, endure such bitter endings that it becomes defining for us, like a new name or a social status, as if this is our destiny, to be widowed, to be divorced, whatever it might be, to be lonely, to be bitter, to be consumed by grief, we will either be stitched back together, held in the blanket of others who love and care for us, who remind us that we are a blessing, who can make space for our complicated selves as we journey through this wilderness, or we will die prematurely. You cannot go it alone. No one ever has. We were not created to be able to. But again, most of us, like Naomi, when we're going through those difficult endings, when we find ourselves in that wilderness, we will either push people away, or we'll try to just fade away into the background and hope that nobody notices. And if we return to community, it's usually only once we're able to carry on again as if we're all good. Or once we've made that arc of redemption complete. We once were lost, but now we're found. Only once we've been able to wrap that story in some new bow will we allow ourselves to be in community again. And so we go through life never letting people truly choose us, love us. And I say this as someone who understands in my bones why Naomi pushes Ruth and Orpah away. I get it. Having lost the people closest to her, the people who held her heart, it's as though Naomi is trying to push them away because that would be more bearable, understandable, something that she could process, rather than keeping them close only to have them potentially leave at some point in the future if they found new husbands, made new families, or because accompanying her just got too difficult. She was too bitter for them to handle. Right? I'm already grieving this loss. Let's just cut the ties now while it's all fresh. Let's just get it over with. Like the rest of us, Naomi pushes those closest to her away when she, like us, most desperately wants, needs for them to draw close to her. Because deep down, she knows, as you and I do, that we cannot go it alone. And if you're skeptical of ancient wisdom, then I'll tell you that scientific research is now finally catching up and confirming this truth. For loneliness, researchers say, not only crushes our souls, but it is also linked to strokes, to heart disease, to dementia, to inflammation, to suicide. That is, it breaks our heart literally as well as figuratively. According to the Surgeon General of the United States, loneliness is as deadly as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, or more lethal than consuming 6 alcoholic drinks a day. And they say, we have been growing more and more lonely as a society. As polarization rises and divisions deepen, as the social fabric of our society continues to fray, what was said of in the time in which Ruth and Naomi lived, that in those days the people did whatever was right in their own eyes, that they failed to truly take care of one another, might also be said of our own times. Now as then, we need to be reminded amidst the massive breakdowns of our world and the endings in our own lives that we cannot go it alone. In an article on loneliness for the New York Times, the celebrated journalist Nicholas Kristof writes, "Social isolation is that rare malady whose cure is fully known and costs relatively little, and yet still so difficult to achieve. In the 21st century, we are a social species living atomized lives. Even when surrounded by people in every direction, we can easily feel bereft and melancholy. And yet there are solutions as well," he says. And while there need to be large-scale governmental efforts to address this epidemic, and some governments around the world are, though not predictably our own government, the solution is as simple as it is difficult. Building real, authentic community. Creating a space that opens us to God's life-giving Spirit so that we would have the courage that it takes to give ourselves to that task, even when we find ourselves wanting to resist it. I would call this, in many ways, our mission as a church, to build this kind of community. And inasmuch as we live out this simple, radical endeavor, we are literally changing the world, saving lives, stitching souls back together, maybe even your own. This is one more way that being part of a smaller church where we can truly know and be known by each other is actually a gift. Bigger isn't always necessarily better, unless in this case you're looking for places to hide. Still, we can also play this game in our small churches, because it turns out that we humans have become pretty adept at self-sabotage. I speak from experience. And so I ask you, as you navigate whatever new season you are finding yourself in, will you garner the courage to risk living into this morning's Advent reminder that you cannot go it alone? Will you risk letting your walls down and letting your Ruths in? so that they can show up for you. And knowing that everyone around, literally everyone, don't believe the masks that we wear. Literally everyone around us is struggling with the same thing. Will you, like Ruth, be the answer to someone else's prayer? Will you garner the courage, even when they attempt to push you away, to say, I am here. I'm not going anywhere. Friends, may it be so. For you, for this church, for the world, that we all may begin again anew. Amen.